forever a genre that has been absolutely dragged by critics, horror has always had a tough time being taken seriously. Considered by some to be irredeemably lowbrow or lacking in any real merit, the genre is more often than not subject to intense scrutiny just for existing. And in some instances, it's easy to understand why, but in others, maybe we should just lighten up a little. I'm Amy from What Culture, and here are 10 bad horror movies everyone gets wrong. 10. Valentine. Much like how Halloween brought the genre to life before it, Scream successfully reanimated the bloated corpse of the slasher genre, and seemingly overnight, moviegoers were bombarded with all manner of stalk and slice films that were keen to get in the box office cash. Most of these were somewhat warmly received by fans and critics, with films like Cherry Falls and I Know What You Did Last Summer still being praised to this day. Sadly, Valentine has never been so lucky. Panned by critics on release due to it bearing too many similarities to older slasher films, the film sits at a woeful 12% on Rotten Tomatoes. Well, if you've seen the movie, you'll know that that's a grotesque over-exaggeration of its supposed badness. Sure, it's not exactly going to win over those at the Academy, but taken for what it is, Valentine is a competently made slasher that's full of nasty little surprises along the way, taking us back to a time when slasher films weren't so reliant on meta-humor and snarky dialogue. It captures the audience's imagination, and it deserves some credit for that. 9. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge. Of all the films on this list, Freddy's Revenge is easily the most well-known example of a supposedly poor film undergoing a reappraisal decades after its release. Its homoerotic undercurrents and the subversion of the final girl trope are often singled out as its strongest elements. Aside from those two aspects though, Freddy's Revenge still has a whole lot to offer for fans of the genre. With numerous gruesome special effects sequences, mean-spirited kills, and one of Robert Englund's most menacing performances, this film really is nowhere near as inept as the reputation might have you believe. Several critics at the time were highly dismissive of the film, with some even going so far as to refer to it as tedious and humorless. It may not be able to fully hold its own when compared to the likes of Craven's original, or in fact the vastly superior Dream Warriors, but Freddy's Revenge is a solid entry into the 80s slasher canon that has far more going on under the hood when compared to its contemporaries. 8. Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation. Given just how far the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series has fallen from grace, it's remarkable that its fourth entry is still considered the worst. And don't get me wrong here, it's not exactly a great film, but when compared to the likes of Leatherface and Texas Chainsaw 3D, it's a borderline masterpiece. The film opens on a nudge-wink text screen that jokingly alludes to the previous movies, before essentially launching headfirst into a highly cynical and darkly funny retelling of the film's first events. Penned by the same writer as the original film, The Next Generation lampoons many of that film's ideas, as well as taking aim at the declining state of the genre at the time. For example, through Leatherface's ineffectiveness and the bizarre ending which implies the film's events have been orchestrated by a mysterious businessman. In retrospect, it's surprisingly satirical, but sadly it's so bogged down in retreading the original that many of its more zany ideas are lost in translation. But really, which of these was the worst movie? This one, or the newest 2022 Texas Chainsaw Massacre? You tell me. 7. Halloween 2: 2009. Rob Zombie's first stab at a Halloween movie did yield mixed results, but for the most part it succeeded in what it set out to do, to reinvent the Halloween franchise and take it in a completely different direction. When the time came for the sequel, Zombie himself had no intention of returning, but he eventually relented when offered creative freedom. And oh my god, does his disdain shine through. Halloween 2 is a much darker, meaner, and genuinely antagonistic film that reveals the nihilism and misery that Zombie had in mind. Unlike other slasher sequels where the characters are able to move on, the survivors of Michael's previous rampage are shown to be highly damaged as a result. The script does tend to buckle under its own weight, but as an exploration of trauma, survivor's guilt, and the way in which violence perverts everything around it, I'm not going to say it's wholly ineffective. Audiences were likely expecting something more akin to previous Halloween entries, but they were presented with something perhaps more oppressive and misanthropic than they were really expecting. It's certainly got its flaws, but it's hard to label it as a truly bad movie. Like seriously, there are much worse movies out there. 6. Seed of Chucky. Upon release, Seed of Chucky was blasted for its overly silly tone and lack of horror, which is somewhat surprising when you consider that the Child's Play series has always pitched its tent in that part of the woods. There's certainly a kernel of truth to these accusations, however, as Seed is more reliant on gross-out gags and meta-humour than any semblance of actual scares or suspense. What it lacks in genuine horror, though, it makes up for in its sheer, unabashed weirdness and dedication to its characters. Moving the action to the bright lights of Hollywood, Chucky and Tiffany find themselves resurrected by their unnatural spawn, Glenn. Having parenthood forced upon the pair allows for us to peel back the layers of their psyche and understand them slightly better as characters, with Tiffany's maternal nature becoming more apparent whilst Chucky's hardwired lust for killing is an affront to his new responsibilities. It's every bit as ludicrous as it sounds, and taken on its own, Seed of Chucky is a gloriously goofy good time and remains largely misunderstood by many. 5. Tusk. It can be hard to think of any redeeming qualities for this movie when you consider that its plot is literally a guy being kidnapped and turned into a big walrus. There's not much more I can say, is there? But considering the origins of Tusk trace back to a joke premise that Kevin Smith pitched on his much-loved podcast, it does make sense that many people would also write this film off as a joke without ever thinking to watch it. The thing is, as much as it's easy to write off a film about a man walrus, the actual product is incredibly disturbing and maybe one of the only horror films that succeeded in making me feel genuinely sick just from a single frame. This is mostly down to the numerous gore gags and nauseating scenes in which protagonist Wallace Bryant is mutilated and repurposed into a human walrus hybrid, all of which is further punctuated by Howe's harrowing backstory, which we're carefully drip-fed alongside all the brutality. It's rare that a film can bolster such a unique and bizarre premise and deliver on it tenfold by balancing the ludicrous nature of its narrative with several scenes that make the audience wince. It's most certainly not a film for everybody, but for those that can get aboard its unashamedly weird wavelength, there's plenty of gruesome delights to be found. 4. Black Christmas 2006. The fact that Black Christmas has been remade twice now is a shocking example of just how far the horror genre is willing to sink. The 2019 version was an ill-conceived train wreck that sought to be topical as opposed to terrifying, but the often overlooked 2006 film is something of a lost treasure. Where the original film relied on atmosphere and persistent dread to unnerve its audience, this 2006 iteration goes for the jugular and offers up an orgy of brutal violence and appallingly bad taste. This may not butter everyone's crumpet, nor did it so upon release, but if you're in the mood for a nasty festive slasher film, then you really can't go wrong with this. The plot is fairly loose and the characters definitely lack depth, but everything else on display is so deliriously deranged that it's easy to simply shut your brain off and enjoy. It doesn't try to be the original film, and it's safe to say that if this film wasn't associated with Bob Clark's festive classic, it would have amassed a much bigger following by now. 3. Jason X. It's a well-worn horror trope that when a franchise is floundering with sequel fatigue, the only logical next step is to launch its main villain into space. Trust me, it works every time. Well, to say that it worked here might be a bit of an exaggeration, but it certainly did something. The Friday the 13th franchise may have begun its life as a set of somewhat serious and gruesome suspense thrillers, but as time went on, the series leaned into its own ridiculous nature, and that is arguably why it's endured as long as it has. This movie is the pinnacle of the franchise poking fun at itself, be it through cheeky nods to previous entries or its gleaming self-awareness that lets the audience in on the joke. It doesn't take itself seriously in the slightest, and once you give yourself over to its schlocky charms, you're going to have a good time with it. The late era Friday the 13th films are a mixed bag for sure, so it's understandable as to why many fans weren't appreciative of the film's overt campiness. But it's hard to call any movie an objectively bad movie when you're launching a supervillain into space. 2. A Cure for Wellness. Easily one of modern horror's most unsung treasures, A Cure for Wellness has had cult classic written all over it since the day it was unleashed. This spiraling gothic oddity has enthralled and befuddled audiences in equal measure with its gargantuan length, dizzying tonal shifts, and truly horrific imagery, but the common consensus seems to be that the film isn't particularly good. And whilst it's certainly a matter of opinion, I'm going to say your opinion's wrong. The film has lots of saving graces, you've just got to open your eyes to them. It's likely that many folks were drawn into the trailer's promise of a medical malpractice and body horror focus, but they were instead greeted with something more old-fashioned, something that took heavy inspiration from the European horror films of decades gone by, even down to those films' penchant for truly nauseating gore shots. Given where modern horror's been going for the past few years, it's easy to understand why A Cure for Wellness was so easily binned when people wanted cerebral terror over old-fashioned gothic atmosphere. And whilst the plot isn't exactly going to win any awards, it does have a compelling central mystery that'll keep you guessing right up until the end. 1. Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me. Few shows can claim to be as important or as groundbreaking as Twin Peaks was for its time. Its unequivocal strangeness captured the minds and hearts of millions, even if they didn't quite understand what was going on. But despite the adoration that so many have for the series, its subsequent film adaptation has never fared so well, with many even going so far as to say it's the worst part of the Twin Peaks canon, which is strange when you consider the latter half of Season 2 still exists. Analysis of the show aside, Fire Walk with Me is a largely misunderstood film. On the surface, it's merely a prequel, but it really should be viewed as its own separate entity. Not only because it's in a completely different medium, but tonally and stylistically, it's a far cry from the show's soap opera gone wrong approach. It's also callously cruel and deeply disturbing, a film that's anchored by a show-stopping performance by Cheryl Lee that really deserves to be seen and appreciated for what it is. Submerge yourself in its darkness and you'll definitely see what the fuss is all about. Suspend your disbelief for a bit. You might have some fun. And that is actually the last entry on this list of 10 bad horror movies everyone gets wrong. Did you actually enjoy any of these? For me, it's a cure for wellness. I can see so much good in that movie that apparently no one else can. Let us know in the comments down below. And remember to check out whatculture.com for more lists and articles like this every single day. As always, I've been Amy from What Culture, and I'll catch you next time.